Hello and welcome to Insight, a show where we have courageous conversations about social justice and the issues affecting the citizens of the region of Peel and beyond. I'm one of your hosts, David Barnwell. And to introduce the topic this evening, I'm going to talk about a profession. It can be very two-sided. This is a profession where you can feel empowered, perhaps even find a way to pay your way through college if that was the case. But on the flip side, and slightly more, in fact, quite a bit more negative aspect of it, instead of feeling empowered, you could feel exploited, trapped, abused, put down. I'm talking about the sex workers trade, which is very prevalent but hardly talked about. In fact, it's only in these last few years that it's really starting to get mainstream attention. Well, that's what we're here to uncover on today's episode of Insight. And I'm joined by three very special hosts here at Insight, our usual two hosts, Ranjit and Dave, as well as our special guest host, Adam. And we have two guests joining us today who will be sharing their authentic story about their experience in the sex workers trade. Over to you, Ranjit.
Welcome to Insight, another courageous conversation. And today we have two guests that are joining us to talk about sex work. And so both of our guests have chosen to remain anonymous. And so we'll be filming, in the show and not showing their faces, but their voices will be there and we'll be interviewing them as we would normally in our show. So thank you very much, Jeff and Jane, for joining us today. We're really proud to have you here because we know that it takes a lot of courage to be able to speak about a topic that sometimes is taboo and there's stigma attached to it. But we're really, really grateful that you've had the courage to be here. So thank you for joining us. So we're going to start with inviting you to share what sex work is. And maybe if you could start that, Jeff,
Sure.
And what your experience of sex work is.
Sure. So broadly speaking, sex work is an exchange, generally thought of as an exchange of money for services. Those are sexual services, obviously, in the name. And that can be a broad range of anything. That can go from dancing, exotic dancing, occasionally pornography, but most commonly, at least my experience, is escort services, where you meet somebody one-on-one and you exchange services for a set rate. You had touched on stigma.
Right.
Sorry, what was the second part of your question?
So for me, what's important for us to understand is how you got into sex work and what the barriers were as a sex worker.
Sure. I got into it, my own experience. I was a student doing my undergrad, living in Toronto, so student loans weren't necessarily paying for all the all the expenses. It covered a bit of rent, and that was it, and my tuition, of course. But I wanted I wanted a more sort of stable life so I could study and do well in school. So I had known a friend who was engaging in sex work, and I then decided to go into it. There was no real barrier for me to engage in it. The barriers I later discovered were stigma, representation, how sex workers are represented on television, in the media, in the news media often, as being either diseased or victims or being, sort of majorly empowered, right? Both of these, this is a binary that I think is flawed, there's a lot of mix of those things. And in my experience, really it's stigma that has most negatively impacted me, and a lack of rights from the legal system.
And we see that the numbers in terms of people that are going into sex work is actually growing. So it's something that we have, as a community, have to start thinking about how to support our sex workers and keep them safe.
Absolutely. Sex workers are a part of our communities. We are people. We range we're men, we're women, we're trans people, we are queer, we're straight, we're you know,
Yeah.
your neighbor could be a sex worker, your neighbor might see sex workers, and you're absolutely right. There are more and more sex workers making themselves visible and making themselves known, and so it's important for us to be incorporated in our communities and be somewhat accepted or welcomed, because right now sex workers face violence based on these misconceptions that I think we find from the community at large or society at large, and certainly in the legal system.
And would you be able to speak a bit more to, like, you know, like the laws have sort of just recently changed
Sure.
concerning sex work, and if you'd be able to sort of speak to maybe a little bit about what the laws are and how that has impacted sex workers?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's important to know that in Canada, the act of sex work has actually never been illegal, but certain aspects of it have been, which hinders a sex worker's ability to safely work. In December 2014, I believe it was, Bill C-36, the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act, was passed by the Conservative government as a response to, quote, protect exploited peoples, but in that is the assumption that sex workers are inherently exploited, when in reality we're not, and we don't generally identify as such. And in fact, many people are exploited in many other parts of the labor market, not simply sex work, not just sex work, and not as a result of sex work. In fact, it's the laws that harm us the most, and it's the laws that allow people who mean to do us harm, the laws allow them to further cause harm if they so wish, because there's no legal strategy for us there's no legal recourse for us to go to the police and make a complaint against somebody who may have been violent, may have not paid us, may have, whatever the situation is. And so Bill C-36, passed in December 2014, possibly December 13, and criminalizes more aspects of sex work, sort of around sex work. So sex workers are not allowed to work together, which is a thing that sex workers did to maintain safety for one another. They kept an eye on each other. With Bill C-36, two sex workers working together can be considered conspiring to commit a crime with one another. So it further isolates sex workers. And street-based sex workers also face the larger brunt of this law, because they're one of the laws in C-36 stipulates that if you impede traffic, then you can get you're criminalized. The police can stop you and harass you. So it's pushing sex workers further away from main thoroughfares into darker alleys, literally darker places where violence could potentially take place. And negotiating with clients around safety, safe sex practices, and rate becomes hurried, which further makes their jobs harder.
So the barriers are about not being able to talk about it, not being open about it, and the lack of resources that may be available to support you.
Yeah, that can be said. Really what sex workers in the sex worker rights movement are fighting for is full decriminalization and labor rights, like all other parts of the labor market, right? If an employer is exploitative, then most people can have recourse. Sex workers don't, because of the criminalization we face. So what sex workers are really fighting for is recognition as our work being legitimate, as being real work, and having the same labor laws apply to us the same way.
Right. So for you, Jane, what's been your experience in sex work?
A lot different than Jeff's. I got kicked out when I was younger, and I was on the streets. I was hungry, and a man pulled up and asked me if I needed to make some money. I went with him, and it kind of started off from there. And when I finally went to go get help to find a place, instead of just paying for hotel rooms and sleeping on the street, I was, I don't know how to put it, made to look bad.
Right. So you felt violated.
Yeah,
right?
They assumed I was an addict, and I wasn't. And after that, I got frustrated and didn't want to deal with them anymore.
Right.
And
so there were labels that were attached to you that made you feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And you were there not out of choice.
No, because
as some
I had
are.
nowhere to go and nothing to eat.
Right.
And after that, I tried to go to a shelter, which again, I was labeled and treated badly because of the work I did. They didn't want me there. And yeah.
And you were uncomfortable talking about it. So obviously if you were in a shelter, they were asking you questions. Did you feel violated when you were having to answer questions that you were uncomfortable with?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And so that violation carried on for how long?
I had gotten sick of it, and I just went right back to street working and sleeping in hotels and sleeping on the street because I just didn't want to be labeled and just put down all the time for
Right.
it.
Were there any services that, or any places that you were treated fairly, or that you were able to talk about those things in a way that was good for you, or that was helpful, or?
Not till I stopped sex working. Now that I've stopped sex working, it's like these places are opening up more, and the drop-in center at John Howard is amazing. I wish that was there when I was going through what I was going through. But yeah.
What Jane is really emphasizing is that, sorry, and I don't want to put words in your mouth at all, so please interrupt me if I am. But sort of this failure to acknowledge sex work as a choice of limited choice among limited choices, and so it sounds like Jane's experience was very there was no other option.
Yes.
And so she had to engage in sex work, but then was not able to access other means to find a comfortable living situation or and a way out if that's what she wanted, and that's where certain social organizations fail to help not just sex workers but other street involved people. Of course, people do certain things to survive because they need to, and poverty is a cycle. So sex work sometimes is a choice among very limited choices when you have very few options left, and we need to have social service organizations that can meet people where they're at, and not judge people based on their working experience
Right.
in sex work if they're willing to help those people.
What I'd absolutely like to see is a place where women can go for a shelter and not be judged, not have to worry about whether they're going to get kicked out the next day because they didn't come home because they had to work.
Yeah.
You know, something where you can feel safe and supported and have the freedom to be who you are or what you want to do.
Absolutely.
So in shelters, for example, we need to somehow recognize that there may be people with children that are in shelters that have perhaps never had the sense of dignity because they've never felt that they can actually talk about what they're going through and share what they're going through, and therefore have never had the support that they need in order to remain there and access the service that really they are entitled to. Does that ring true?
It
Jane?
does, but people that work at these shelters and other places, as soon as you say that you're involved in sex working,
Right.
they almost don't want you there anymore.
Right.
They try and make it so that you have to leave.
Really?
So there is no help from them.
No.
You're just left to go back to the same stuff you were doing before.
Right. So there isn't any dignity attached to it because
Not in their eyes.
that's right. Yeah. And is that the same with the male sex work as well? Do you find that if you
I think it's really important to qualify that my experience is an extremely privileged one. My background, I come from a lot more privilege, it sounds like, than what Jane might be
Right.
coming from. But working working for nonprofits in Toronto, I know that we've made strides to make sure that certain social service organizations that don't necessarily focus on sex work but focus on poverty, economic injustice, drug use, people who are street involved, that they also in their mandate say that they don't judge people based on their sex working experience, and that they meet people where they're at. And so sex work is not some mitigating factor of whether they can access help or not. So my work with other workers in Toronto is that we have some, but not enough, organizations that don't necessarily follow what it sounds like Jane's experience was, which is a disgusting experience. It sounds like a really
I
awful
agree.
experience because that's not how
I
people should be
agree.
treated.
Yeah.
And it's how do we make it so that institutions understand that that language has to change, that
Yeah.
the way we treat people has to be with dignity and respect,
No matter what,
regardless,
yeah.
right? And without judgment, as you
Absolutely.
suggested. And that's a difficult one, isn't it? It's difficult because now we're talking about training major institutions, because it's not just one service, right? It's hospitals,
Yeah.
right? It's nonprofit organizations, it's healthcare, it's, you know, the institutions gradually have to come to terms with understanding what those needs are.
Sorry, I think it has to go further than just institutional change. I think this is a societal shift that needs.
I agree.
Individuals need to think about sex workers as human beings, as workers that deserve rights, that need unions, and when we all think that way, then I can see our institutions changing.
So your key message then, what would it be to our community, our viewers, in terms of the change that we want to see happen?
To understand that, I think it goes back to what I had said earlier about sort of this binary of liberation, sex workers who are liberated and have all this agency, and then sex workers who are considered to be victims inherently. And we need to break that binary because it's simply untrue. We need these institutions that you're talking about to not judge a sex worker like Jane as being making this choice that's putting her at risk of receiving benefits or aid, and also not trying to come in and what we say a rescue, these organizations that come in and try to rescue sex workers from sex work, but really they're doing more harm by essentially telling them that sex work is bad, that they're victims, that they, you know, this
Right.
sort of thing. So we need to see sex workers as people, as part of our community, and coming from all walks of life, just like anybody else.
Right. What message would you like to leave with our audience? What change do you want to see happen?
I just want people, if you're going to work in an organization meant to help people, to have some respect for no matter who you're talking to remember they're human and we care and feel things just like you do.
Thank you very much for joining us today. We really appreciate the courageous conversation that we've had to have, and I know how difficult it's been. But I think it's important for our viewers to understand the experiences that you have and the change that we need to make. And by being here on the show today, you've inspired us to begin to demand the sorts of change that we need to have. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
so
you.
much, guys.
So we're going straight to Play Matters, and we'll be back in just a moment with the next segment of a courageous conversation on sex work.
I'm Nicole, and this is Dragon, and today on Play Matters, we'll be doing care packages.
Giving back to the community provides a sense of belonging and purpose. When individuals need a helping hand, it's our responsibility and the responsibility of the community to come together and provide support. One of the ways you can provide support is by creating care packages. Those in need can benefit from care packages. Care packages can include anything from personal hygiene products, clothing, toys, to non-perishable food items. Here, we have our bag. You can use a backpack or anything else you want. So let's make our care package. We're going to put in some essentials like
Shampoo and conditioner, deodorant,
markers,
toothpaste,
pencils,
maybe a t-shirt.
maybe a sharpener and a notebook.
We can include some fun things like toys for children,
Or books for children to read.
as well as essentials like shavers and shaving cream and mouthwash,
Why not throw in some fun toys?
some stickers,
A toothbrush is always a good idea.
some more toys for children, and some crayons.
And there you have it, your care package.
As you make these care packages with your children, you can discuss the importance of giving and receiving without shame. It is important that we share these materials with others. If you don't know of a person in need, care packages can be donated to communities or organizations within your area. These include like food banks, places of worship, women's shelters, youth centers, hospitals, nursing homes, and so many more. That's it for today.
Thank you for joining us on Play Matters.
Was that?
Welcome back to Insight, our segment on research. And we have an amazing guest with us today, Arlene Pitts. And she is a harm reduction worker and a sex work activist. And we're really thrilled for her to be here because she's done a lot of research in the area. And we'd like you to share that with us, Arlene. Just tell us what your research is about and tell us how you got interested in it in the first place and what's inspired you.
Okay. Well, that's a huge question. So, I will give you a little bit of background about myself. I was street involved at a pretty young age, and I've seen the impacts of failed policy and laws directly on my community. So that politicized me at a young age where I seen drug policy and other laws capture people that I loved. Yeah. My father died from an opiate overdose, so I experienced preventable death at a pretty young age. And so that is where I my background into wanting to create change in policy. So my research was for my master's thesis, and that I completed at York for the public policy program. And so that research was specific around the criminalization of sex work and the impact of the criminalization on street-based sex workers. So that was...
so can you explain that to us? What is the criminalization of sex work?
So it's a bit complicated. So the criminalization of sex work, I feel like there is a long history in Canada, what that kind of looks like. And so the background to my research was it's named Remembering Bedford. So that name itself goes into the Bedford case, which was the case where we seen 3 sex workers come together and file a suit and take the Canadian government to court around the 3 main laws that put criminal sanctions on sex work. And so those 3 laws were, one was which was called the Living on the Avails Law, which is usually renamed as the Pimping Law, which captures third parties or people that live off the profits of a sex worker. Right. So living off the avails, the Communicating Law, which put criminal sanctions on how sex workers would communicate their transactions for their business. And then there was the Body House laws, which put criminal sanctions on where sex workers could and couldn't work. Right. So these 3 laws went to the highest court. They went to the Supreme Court, and the case became known as the Bedford case. And so at the Supreme Court, it was these 3 laws were found unconstitutional and were struck down. So for a moment in Canadian history, we seen the potential of decriminalization of sex work, meaning no laws or regulations around the purchasing and selling of sex. So within this ruling, it gave the Canadian government 1 year, allowed them 1 year to rewrite these laws. And so the Conservative government at that time chose to rewrite these laws. And what they introduced was a new package called Bill C-36. And that was titled the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act. And so within this package, it was a recriminalization of prostitution. And so they marketed it as a package that was saving women from exploitation. So it conflated that sex workers were all exploited, and also conflated sex work from a human trafficking discourse as well. So within that package, it was also displayed as not criminalizing the selling of sex. It was criminalizing the purchasing. So, so what people name as Johns, or sex workers usually identify as clients, it puts criminal sanctions onto the clients. But in actuality, when you do read through the laws, it recriminalizes sex workers, and a lot of the same language from the old laws were introduced into these laws. So it was the communicating law, for instance, which really targets street-based sex workers, which are they are the lowest number of people that participate in the sex industry, but they are the highest percentage of that experience criminal sanctions.
Okay.
Okay, so the communicating
This is specifically street-based sex work.
that law targets,
That it targets,
captures.
yes.
Yeah, it captures other people, but it's specifically the statistics and research that those are the people that are captured under this law are street. They are like amongst the most criminalized.
So now I do want to ask something in regards to exactly that. Our previous guest had mentioned that he's on a different side of the business, something like escorting, where it's someone called someone, asked them to come over, and they provide service. Where does that fall into the category in this?
What do you mean, what category?
So,
Can you clarify?
I just wanted to know, as you said street-based sex work seems to be the most targeted and sanctioned according to this law. I just see, in my opinion, and pardon if this is my ignorance, but I look at there being no difference between either side of it. The street just looks different. Sometimes the street comes in, you know, a silver rectangle that we put on our on our ear.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, yeah, like someone that is in support of sex work definitely is not going to see a difference. There is, like, you know, just like in any kind of labor, there is a hierarchy that evolves, right? But that's different from the point that they do experience the highest rates of violence. They do experience the highest rates of criminalization. Their community is under threat from state violence on a daily basis. Not saying that in-call workers don't experience those, but they experience these at such a higher level. So. And when we talk about my research, it was specifically focused on street-based sex work because a lot of information out there focuses on indoor sex work, and this is a voice that's really lost but is the most impacted. So my research was participatory action research, very specifically because it wanted to give a voice to those that aren't included in the discussions.
The most vulnerable,
so
right?
I try not to use that language.
Okay.
I really, and I've used it in the past, but it just removes agency. And if someone reads the words that's included in my research, these women have more agency than most people you meet. You know, they're sassy, they're feisty, and they're not going to call themselves vulnerable. So
but
like
they're resilient, right? They're resilient. They're the ones that just keep going.
Yes, and
right?
instead of saying vulnerability, I like to use that they're under threat. Yes. Because they're under threat of state violence, under threat of the realities of living in a world that criminalizes their lives and their work.
Right.
Right? And so
what we're seeing is that there is a growth in Peel of sex workers, and I don't know whether it's just that sex work is growing or whether it's just that we're talking about it more now because we have services that are reaching out to them. What are you thinking, Adam?
Is it that it's just more visible, or?
Well, I mean, I would say that if you ask most people in Peel, they would say that there really isn't it happening unless they happen to live in the neighborhood where street-based sex work is happening. I don't think it is a discussion that's really happening. I would say it's probably been here for a while. It's just like homelessness. Like,
that's right.
Apparently Peel doesn't have a homeless problem, but there are a lot of people who are homeless.
People.
And it's and depending on what community you're operating in terms of sex work, it may be completely hidden. A lot of it is very hidden, and there aren't really services
very
in the region to handle.
So just
or
to
deal with
add, like, sex work takes place everywhere.
Yeah.
Of course.
In every neighborhood,
in every culture.
Community.
Yeah.
It's not something like the law that was introduced. It has this undertone or this its focus is to actually abolish sex work. But no, sex work is not something that we don't want to remove from society. This is people's work. Right. This is people's lives, right? Sex work is work, and I think that we need to acknowledge that instead of be like, put this fear around, there's sex workers in my neighborhood, or it's growing. Or, why are we fearing it? Why are we fearing sex work to grow?
I completely agree with that. When I look at that conversation that you've just had, people are fearing that it's now come to our neighborhood, it's growing.
Yeah.
Why is there such a fear when there's such an increase in the usage and the widespread usage of things like Tinder or Grindr? Just because there's no dollar exchange doesn't make it any different. So
I think it's more about what can we do as a community to ensure that sex workers are safe.
So that's interesting.
And that the resources are out there in order to make it safe for them.
So it's interesting that you say that, because my research really shows that it's the criminalization that creates these atmospheres that make unsafe environments for people to engage
fear,
in sex work.
A reason for us not to discuss it.
Well, but it also creates situations where violence can happen and where people don't have safe places to go when violence does happen to them. So, for instance, like in Toronto, we used to have a special victims unit that worked side by side with sex workers to create this program where some street-based sex workers, especially the ones in my project, identified that they felt safe going to this one officer and to disclose if they did experience violence, right? And this project has been abolished and has been created into an anti-human trafficking unit. Whereas, so no longer do these sex workers have a place or a resource for them to go and feel safe. And so I just think it's important that we talk about what these resources look like, because a lot of them have an agenda that's not the same agenda as the sex workers, right? And their voices need to be included in what these programs or what safety looks like for themselves. And all too often, agencies and organizations believe that what they believe is what sex workers need, and that's not always the reality, right? Needs may be very different. A lot of these projects focus on human trafficking efforts or exiting strategies where they offer you services as a sex worker as long as you are willing to go through the steps to exit the industry, right? Whereas
so it's like a treatment. It's almost as though, we're treating you and now you're not a sex worker anymore.
It's similar to harm reduction, right? Like, whereas a lot of programming are focused on abstinence, when in the reality is, why don't we support people where they're at? And why do we want to judge and push them through? Let's let people make decisions about their lives for themselves, right? And so it's crystal clear in my research that the real safety concerns are coming from the state and those that uphold the state laws. Like, one of the most powerful quotes came from a woman in my research that said she is more terrified of police than she is of predators or bad dates. Like, that's terrifying, right?
It
That
is.
those that are upholding these laws
Right.
are more
The ones-
feared than what people think are the bad dates or the ones that, you know, so and then it's the third parties and the clients that are the ones that are being targeted under these laws. If we really want to support sex workers, we need to listen to their voices.
And I think that's the absence. That's in a lot of institutions, and the police force is just one of them. But the absence of training or absence of understanding of those voices that need to be at the table, that need to be understood, is actually absent. So when there is training, it's a middle class or upper class white person that does the training with absolutely no understanding of what sex work is,
Absolutely.
or where they are, or what their
Yeah.
experience
If
is.
that happens at all.
If it happens at all, I
Yeah.
absolutely agree. So what do we do then to make sure that that voice is at that table in order to make those changes?
So I think it's really important to support initiatives that are participatory, right? Like participatory research, like I was conducting, where it's sex workers that are leading and sex workers, like sex worker only spaces, right, are very important. And programming there's a lot of peer programming, but like where this programming is actually run and by and for people with lived experiences or living experiences.
Or allies that are really passionate about seeing that change and making it happen. But that authentic voice at the table is absolutely critical for change.
Absolutely. And I
because
would
that understanding comes from them.
I would say when speaking about allies are so important and they play an important role, but I think it's also important for allies to recognize that they don't have those lived experience
agree.
or that lived knowledge, and so there needs to be specific space for those that are living the realities to be able to identify what their needs are for themselves, or if they even have needs, right?
So your key message in 20 seconds is what? What do you want our audience to know?
What do I want the audience to know is that the current political system and the criminal sanctions that exist right now still continue to criminalize and impact sex workers. And it's not only the Protective Communities and Exploited Persons Act. Sex workers are captured under so many different laws. So even if that was abolished, that there's drug laws that impact sex workers, there's policies, there's bylaws, there's all kinds of different policies and regulations that impact the work and lives of sex workers. So I think that these need to be abolished and removed, and if they are changed, that sex workers' voices need to be there at the table, and not just sex workers that work indoors, specifically street-based sex workers that experience the impact of these sanctions the most.
Thank you very much for being with us, Arlene. Your voice really has been heard, and we're going to support the best that we can. We'll post some links on our Facebook page. So we're going straight to our next artist right now, and we'll be back for the next segment in just a while, so stay tuned. Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Foluke Akimboyo, and I am with Miss Abel's Canvas. Today I'm going to be doing a spoken word piece on passive exclusion. Justice for all, equality for who? I select my dumpster one from another. They tell me where to go, they tell me what to do, what to say, who to talk to. They all assume. But do they really know my dire need? Are they really aware of my inner state, My community uses their eyes to gauge me, and their mouths as flying daggers, striking me from every corner. Gravel is in my head and between my thighs, but no one knows. So I use multiple pills to stay sane. And when I'm out, my speech is slurred and my walk is bent. And the candy cuffs find me. But I legally work though, and they speak of me like I'm a waste, when all I want, when all I need is to be included, is for my voice to be heard, is to have a voice at all, and to break through the society's limitations against me. But the stereotypes hold me back, and the judgment walls limit me. I can climb over, I can break through. But I keep struggling, I keep fighting, because I know that I want a better life. I know I want something different. How conscious are we? Do we truly understand? Hi, my name is Shame. I am a multiple of different shades and different colors. I am a destitute sex worker. Thank you.
Welcome back to Insight, our segment on Voice to Action, an important segment that shares with our audience resources that are available out in our community. So we're going to start with Natalie and Jody. Thank you for joining us today. We'll start with you, Natalie. If you can share a little bit about the work that you're doing and why you're so passionate about it.
Well, I started at PL HIV AIDS Network as a student placement, doing harm reduction work with Adam. And part of the reason that I wanted to do the work, obviously, was because it was something that was really personal to me. Going out on outreach, I was seeing the same kind of struggles that women that were involved in sex work were having, that I had for 12 years in the region, not having resources. So I approached Adam and asked him if it was something that we could work on together. Through that, Adam involved me in the Patch Collaborative, which I'll let him talk about. And the drop-in came about for women in the region.
And that was a huge gap, right? There was, and it came out of your understanding of what sex work was and what the resources were that were missing and were absent. And you helped build that resource and help fill some of that gap, or start that gap being filled.
I think I started the conversation.
Right.
I didn't fill I don't feel like I filled a large gap. I just identified individuals.
You started it, Natalie. Whether you like it or not, you actually started it. You started that movement. You started filling in that gap because you were talking about it at PPAC, for example. The first time I heard you actually talk about the gap and making it happen.
Well, I wanted to make sure that the individuals that it was affecting, that they knew that somebody was noticing and somebody was talking about it. And they weren't talking about it from the view of addictions or housing, or just the fact that, there are women in the region that are involved in sex work that can't go out to services and programs and supports and identify as sex workers with sex work issues because they're either addicts, they're either homeless, they had to fit under those categories, or they're going to get a meal. This was somewhere, I wanted to create somewhere where they could come together, have conversations, and really let me know what they needed. And
now, is this center only for women, or is it open to men, trans?
So we're housed at John Howard Society. It's every Monday from 10 till 12. It's an open drop-in for women who identify as sex workers. Trans women are welcome to come in. We haven't explored having something available for male sex workers yet, just because we don't have enough resources to support sex workers in general. And like I said, we went through Patch to get this started. And the angle on that was that women weren't connecting to case management services that were really directed towards like their needs in different areas. So males were being referred to Patch, and I was a link to bring women in, having this drop in.
So yeah, we applied for funding through Patch, and it was a very small amount of funding.
Can you explain what Patch is?
So
please?
Patch is it's a program that was started a couple of years ago by a collective of service providers. We got funding from the region on a collaborative grant that we covered essentially having an intensive case management with a case manager, a housing worker, and then we applied for funding specifically to start a female-identified sex work drop-in, and to have it peer-led, so that the little amount of money, which I think was like $1,400 or something for a year, covered the cost of paying a peer to be there once a week, and Save a Food Bank was generous enough to be donating food for snacks for the women who came, and John Howard provided the space, which is in an area where a lot of the street-based sex work is happening.
We also have had other sex workers donate things to the girls. They came up and made Christmas baskets. Women that I know throughout different regions made baskets and bags for the women because we literally only have the funding to pay for somebody to be there to run the space in terms of just opening the door and getting it prepared, because the girls really did run the space themselves. The conversations were led by them. So yeah.
And you've given them dignity. I mean, the women
Well,
to
I think
actually
they already
come
have
forward.
that. It's just that there was nothing specifically for sex workers happening in the region, and yeah, I mean, it started that conversation to be able to broaden. And I mean, the reason we picked a drop-in was we were going through a lot of the research around sex work and sex work specific services, and we tried to talk to agencies that were run by sex workers for sex workers to if we were going to run a drop-in, what should that look like, or what have been successful models for that?
But the agencies you spoke to weren't in Peel. They
No,
were
they
in
were
Toronto.
in Toronto. So we consulted with
yeah.
Maggie's and
Yes.
a number of others to try to sort of
Yeah.
model it in a similar way, so
Right.
that
This was also during the time where the consultations were happening.
Right.
And the biggest message that came out of that was listening to the voice of the people
Right.
that were affected by this. So creating a drop-in allowed
Yeah,
for
yeah.
women to come together and talk about what they thought they needed help with, not what we thought they needed help with.
Right.
And,
course.
and I mean, having those conversations, when we're talking about housing, it's very different from housing, for somebody that just needs housing. Because yes, I need housing, but I'm not on OW, or I want to work from home. What do I do? How do I keep myself safe? So the solutions for housing are going to be very different. And listening to those conversations, that's where you get that information. It's something that I went through 12 years ago. I can't make those decisions for anybody else. So having that group was a way of finding out what's currently going on and how can I help you.
What would you say? I mean, what do you think the impact of the drop-in has been, or?
What I found is a lot more girls are willing to come out and say I'm a sex worker and I need help, or I want to get involved. So we now have other peers running the drop-in. I kind of had to keep going out there and being like me, I want to talk about this, and now I don't have to do that because the talk is happening.
Yeah.
And women who didn't have the trust in the system before, or didn't want to reach out for help because they didn't want to hear about addictions, they didn't want to hear about different strategies that didn't work for them, came to me, and we managed to get 6 women housed.
So that connection is really important.
Yeah.
You know, and so that's really critical. So Jody, you work with Elizabeth Fry, and you are involved in a program with human trafficking.
Yes,
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I wanted to make that distinction that you know, the work that we do is quite different. We're working with victims of human trafficking or survivors of human trafficking. In particular, sex trafficking. So girls who, and again, young girls who are being trafficked.
So it's one aspect of human trafficking.
Right, and the difference would be there's coercion, deception, manipulation, power and control exerted over these girls.
Right.
They're you know, put into the sex trade, but someone else is making the money, not them. So our Empowering Against Exploitation program is a program that is really preventative and intervention based. We go into a number of different environments. So we go into schools, we go into foster agencies, shelters, group homes, really anywhere there's girls, because we feel that it's an important message to get across. So the aim of the program is to empower girls with information and knowledge so that they can avoid exploitive situations. So what we're trying to do is make girls in Peel safer, help them to be able to make better decisions when they're faced with exploitive situations, be able to recognize and avoid. We're trying to increase protective factors, because some of those things are you know, decreased self-esteem or low self-esteem is something that you know, traffickers look for when they're looking to exploit girls. So we're trying to build up those things. We're looking to...
Are schools open to that, Jody? Are schools, for example, when I was a vice principal, we used to have a safety program or a YES program, and those were about youth education safety, and the police was involved. Is that where you could have that network, you know, working together and making this a part of a program that may already exist?
It is. It can be problematic when running in schools, and sometimes you know, alterations are made based on their mandates and that sort of thing. But when we're running them in the shelters, group homes, and our agencies, what we're looking at is helping girls to you know, letting them know about recruitment strategies, what's happening out there, red flags. We're talking about you know, just keeping themselves safe, and how do they go about doing that, resources that are available if they find themselves in these situations, healthy sexuality, healthy relationships, online safety, what are their vulnerabilities and what can they do you know, about that.
And it seems to me that it's really important to get the message out broadly.
Yes, definitely.
Sorry, Deb, what were you saying?
I was just going to ask, where did the idea for this program come from, and why is it a priority for Elizabeth Fry?
Well, through the provision of our other programs, which are primarily justice in nature, we saw this as something that was increasing across the board. So
within
you know,
the region,
yes,
within our region,
yeah,
Peel.
within the programs that we, you know, so yes, in Peel. We were seeing this across all the programs, and my managers were coming to me to tell me that, you know, this is something that is an issue. We were seeing not just increasing numbers of girls involved in trafficking, but we were seeing, you know, how the recruitment strategies and things like that were very different. So girls were being brought in through, you know, techniques such as boyfriending, which is, you know, someone poses as a boyfriend, pretends that, you know, they care about the girl. They, you know, and
like over the course of a few months.
Oh, it can. The grooming can take a very long time.
Wow.
These traffickers are very invested because sex trafficking is very lucrative. They can make $280,000 per girl per year.
Wow.
This is one of the fastest growing crimes in Ontario. And estimates of girls, you know, involved are, you know, well into the, you know, in the thousands.
And I think
so. This is something that was, you know, quite troubling, obviously, to us. So we wanted to, you know, ensure that there were resources to combat this in our region. Also, you know, sadly enough, you can buy books on Amazon that teach people how to exploit girls. You know, how do they go about breaking girls' spirits, and you know, what that looks like. So.
So think about your key message. What is it that we can do? What is it that you're doing already? And you've shared some of that that could change the way people see sex work.
I think a lot of like what my message is to listen to what the individuals that are experiencing it are saying. Oftentimes, like we want to work on like a case scenario and use that to build things. We have to listen to the individuals that are being affected by what's going on in their life, and I think that works for both of us. For trafficking and for sex workers, the issues are very different, but sometimes they can be the same. Like we don't know until we listen to individuals, and I've always had a problem with immediately victimizing somebody, because if they don't see themselves as a victim or somebody that needs to be cheered on and saved and helped or pushed along because they're okay, there's no need to take that away from them. So I really do feel like we need to listen to what sex workers are saying now, and from that build supports for them. Right. We don't have the supports in place right now. We have a drop-in, and we're struggling through, and we'll figure it out. Eventually something will happen and programs will happen, but until then it's just listening and being available.
So Jody, from your perspective, what do you think in terms of sex trafficking is something that we can do, that we know that we can step up now
What
to try and
can we
help?
do? I think awareness. There's been a number of exposés in papers as of late. People have probably seen the Toronto Star, and it's also run in other community papers. I think that prevention, which is why we've focused on empowering against exploitation, prevention is a big step. I think that, again, more services, definitely higher funding, and dedicated services as well, not subsuming into other services that are available. And one of the other things that we've started, I was mentioning to Natalie, is we've started a female mobile support program that is working also with girls who are looking to exit traffic situations. So that's a support worker who works alongside them. And again, it's very much focused on their choices and what they see and how they want to rebuild their lives and what needs to be done. It could be immediate needs in the beginning, the crisis stage of food, shelter, clothing, and then from there on, all the way through stabilization. We work with girls in that capacity as well.
Excellent. Thank you very much for joining us today. So what we need to do is listen really closely, and try and meet those needs the best that we can within our communities, but providing the authentic voice and the authentic opportunity for the work to be done by people that understand. Thank you very much for joining us today, and make sure you join us again next week for another Insight. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ranjit. I just wanted to add that we have to keep in mind at all times that sex work is not necessarily someone who is trapped in a profession, albeit that is still a category. Whether you're doing it to empower yourself or as a legitimate profession that you wish to follow, or if you are victimized and trapped, there are services for both categories of individuals, and we've seen today that the Elizabeth Fry Society and FAN are excellent places to start if you need more information. Check us out on Facebook, Towards Social Justice, and follow us on Twitter, @TowardsSJ. Again, I'm David Barnwell, and on behalf of your Insight hosts, keep having those courageous conversations.